Okay, today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the deadlift for beginners. So this video is intended for people who are probably maybe working out at home, which I know more people are doing that now, or even maybe you're going to the gym and you're trying to figure the deadlift out. This video is not intended to replace good quality instruction from someone who can teach you how to do a deadlift. Okay, so if you have that option, that's going to be the best option probably. The deadlift is a fantastic exercise if you do it correctly. If you do it wrong, it can ruin your life. So we don't want to ruin our lives. We can all agree on that, I hope. Kind of the catch there is finding someone who can actually teach you how to do a deadlift properly. So that should be more common, but I'm afraid that can be sort of difficult. I can tell you that if you're in a gym and you're trying to figure that out, a decent way to kind of maybe find somebody is try to go to the gym when the personal trainers work out and watch what they do. And like the ones that only do upper body, don't ask them how to do a deadlift. All right, they can probably go through some talking points, but no. Watch the ones that actually follow, like they look like they have some kind of structure that actually do deadlifts. And then, maybe approach them and ask them if you can, even if you, just pay for a couple appointments. I've had people do that over the years where, they didn't want to train on a regular basis, but they just bought like 2 or 3 sessions to learn how to pull. So, and there's other ways you can go about it, but again, this is supposed to be just kind of a basic, simple video to touch on the subject. The other thing this video will be useful for is if you are a personal trainer or a coach and you need some speaking points for the deadlift, hopefully this will be helpful. So something I'm going to touch on real quick, hopefully this won't go too deep in the weeds, but when we're looking at exercise in general, we want to consider that exercise is a form of stress. Okay, now stress can either be beneficial, that's called eustress, or stress can be harmful if we take stress too far. So it's distress. And if you take either one of those to like if you take either one of those too far, I don't really know that you can take eustress too far, but you can take distress too far, that can actually lead to death. We don't hear about death induced from exercise very often, but it has happened. So just keep that in mind. So when we're introducing any kind of a lift, really the goal is to try and introduce the correct kind of stress and the right amount of stress. So like my job as a coach, when I introduce a client to a program, it's to introduce a level of stress that's appropriate for their fitness level and their training age. So as they progress, that stress has to change. And that stress also has to kind of modulate from like program to program. So that doesn't mean that what you should look at basically is like in a training year, there will be times when that goes up and down, but from training year to training year, that overall stress should increase up to a healthy point. So, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because we're going to be looking at the deadlift mechanically and how it can be like a positive stress or it can be a negative stress. So what that means is when I set the deadlift up, it's very important that the load stays very close to my body. Okay, so the body has a center of gravity, and whatever weight you're trying to move, it has a center of gravity as well. Understanding that humans have, some people carry their center of gravity in different places. Some people carry their center of gravity real high. Some people carry it closer to their hips. That's not important in this context. The point is like your center of gravity is in your body somewhere, and that weight has a different center of gravity. So if we keep that weight very close to our body, it's more likely to have a positive stress on the body, specifically the back. Whereas if we let that weight drift away, like you'll see some people do a deadlift and that weight will be pretty far from the body, that puts what's called a shear force on the spine. That's not a good force. So that takes it from being a positive stress into distress. One thing I want to point out is sometimes someone like me will be teaching a class or will get up in front of a camera and we'll say, don't do this because it's bad for you. And someone will go and do that thing and not get injured and think like, well, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, I'm fine. Part of what you have to understand is we're not just looking at a single incident, we would look at the longevity of the subject. So when I'm talking about lifting, I want you to learn to lift in such a way that you can continue to lift for a very long time. All right. I'm 48. I've been lifting since I was 14 in one form or another. A lot of that was not lifting correctly because when I started, I had no bloody idea what I was doing, and there weren't really a lot of good resources when I was young. I probably really didn't kind of get good at lifting till I was in my, probably maybe late 20s, but early 30s. So, and some of that was because I discovered better resources. When I first started doing deadlifts, they weren't nearly as common as they are now. I think now if you go to like an average gym, you're more likely to see people doing some form of a deadlift. But when I got started personal training 20 years ago, you would see some variations like stiff-legged deadlifts, but you wouldn't see like a conventional deadlift or a sumo deadlift like you do now, or even a trap bar. So, okay, so, and I'm not going to go into like all the different styles of deadlift today. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. I'm just going to go over kind of basically what I do when I'm introducing the movement to someone. Now, if I'm introducing someone to a deadlift, they've probably done some things leading up to it, especially if we're in a gym. And I know everyone has kind of different methods, so I'm not going to go into that too much, but basically we want to make sure they have enough strength to kind of perform the action. So now if somebody's working out at home and they have limited resources and they're not going to be lifting very much weight, that might be sort of less of a concern, but you have to take things on a case-by-case basis. So provided that you can move pain-free and you don't have anything preventing you from doing the movement, it's, it can be very beneficial. Things that would prevent you from doing it, I'll just hit on that real quick, are like if somebody, kind of like if they hip hinge and they can't keep straight, if they really kind of go to one side or the other, that's something that should be corrected before they load the spine. Another thing, I had a client several years ago who she had a couple children. One of the children she had carried very low, and it caused her low back to sort of go into lordosis, and the spinous process, so those things that stick out the back of the spine, they were actually connecting with each other, so deadlifts were really uncomfortable for her. So for some people, there can be some things where it's not a good option, but for most people, most of the time, a deadlift is a good thing to throw in there. Let's see here. One of my favorite talking points that I learned from John Clark, who's a firearms instructor, not a strength coach. He said, when you find a good way to do something, do it that way every time. In the context of this subject, what that means is there are a lot of very strong people out there. And when I say very strong, I mean people who can pick up like 3 times their body weight. And they'll do that and they won't have any problems, but then you'll hear about them hurting their back, just picking up like a 45-pound plate or something like that. It's important that you treat a lightweight like it's a heavyweight. So if you have kind of like a way of doing things when the load is heavy and like a completely different way of handling things when the load is not heavy, that isn't good for you. So you want to like, when you pick up a lightweight, treat it like it's a heavyweight. Use the same body mechanics. This is what Stuart McGill calls spine hygiene. So pay attention to that, okay? So just keep that in mind. When you find a good way to do something, do it that way every time. Don't have a heavy mode and a light mode or whatever. So when I go to do a deadlift, so the first thing I want to pay attention to is how close the weight is to my body. Now, if I have a client who doesn't have good range of motion, I will start them in a power rack to introduce the movement sometimes. Obviously, if we're doing that, the load's not going to be very heavy. But if I just want someone to sort of learn how to pull with a barbell, that could be a decent way to introduce it. And some clients, they might never pull from the floor. Okay, I've had some guys who were really tall and really tight because they had desk jobs who really prefer to pull with a trap bar because it's 6 inches higher, or to pull out of a rack. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. However, if you're going to use a trap bar for deadlifts, it is important that you do some additional low back work, because I found that people, like if their deadlift goes up with a trap bar, their low back will get weaker because it doesn't have the same kind of stress. So if you're going to use a trap bar a lot, I think you need to do some like back extensions and things as well. If you're doing regular barbell pulls, you have to pay attention to the form and see, like, if you find like a weak point in the pull, then some low back work may be necessary. But let's see here. So we've talked about center of gravity. So anyway, I want the weight to be close to me. Now, if I'm pulling with a kettlebell, or if I'm doing like dumbbell deadlifts, the mechanics are a little bit simpler because, just because. So, but if I'm pulling with a barbell, and I don't have a barbell at the house, so I'm going to try to demonstrate this with just an old staff that I have from my martial arts days. But it's basically a bar, so it'll work. The way a lot of people will set the deadlift up, the knees will be over the bar. Okay, or the knees might actually be like in front of the bar. So one thing I want to point out, again, I can't demonstrate this because I don't have the right equipment, but if you're lifting at home, or even if you're lifting at a gym, don't put like 25-pound plates on the bar and try to pull from the floor, okay, because it's going to be too low for almost everybody. Now, if you have bumper plates, that's fantastic because that gets rid of that whole problem. And part of the purpose of the bumper plates is they're all the same diameter, so the bar is always the same height. So that's really good if you have access to that. If you don't have access to bumper plates and you're using like steel plates, I would, and you're not strong enough for the 45s, then what you want to do is either like rack the bar on a power rack or a half rack, and unrack it, step back, do your reps, only go down to about mid-shin at the most, and then rack it when you're done until you build up the strength to use the 45s. If I'm pulling from the floor, and so I'm strong enough to do that, the weight's appropriate, so on and so forth. First thing I want to talk about is breathing. Now, in a lot of exercises, I don't like to talk about breathing because I've kind of found that if people don't think about breathing, they'll breathe the way they should. When people start thinking about breathing, then they have to think about it. So with the deadlift, however, knowing how to breathe properly can be a big safety issue. So, and this is something people argue about, so you might want to do some research if you don't know anything about this. But I like to hold my breath when I pull. So, I know some people don't like that, but I've been doing it for a long time and I'm still here. So, so what I will do is I will take a deep breath in through my nose. The reason I breathe in through the nose and not the mouth is because when you breathe in through a smaller orifice, it creates more pressure. What I want to do is create what's called intra-abdominal pressure. So I'll breathe in through the nose, I will contract my abs really hard, and then I'll pick up the weight. Okay? On the top of the deadlift, I'll let off about half the air, I'll take another breath, I'll hold it, then I'll go all the way down. If I'm doing some kind of like Romanian deadlift, where I'm not putting the bar on the floor each rep, I will just breathe on the top, I won't breathe on the bottom. This takes some practice, so don't try to max out with this if you've never done it. You can also, if you're going to breathe when you do it, what you probably want to do is, let me think about this for a second, you probably want to inhale on the way down and exhale on the way up. Some people think that's healthier. You won't use as much weight. You might not care about that, but just keep it in mind. So however you do it, it's going to take some practice. You got to get used to it. As far as the line of pull, so this is really important. You'll see a lot of people when they start their pull that you have a hip angle and you have a knee angle, and a lot of people will try to extend the hips and the knees at the same time. I've even seen people who should know better say to do that. And that is not going to be a good line of pull for most people. So you get your hip angle, you get your knee angle. If you're pulling from the floor, what needs to happen is your knees need to extend first. Your hip angle should not change until that bar is at about knee height. Okay. Now, This takes some practice, but if you learn how to do it, you will get a much better line of pull and a much more fluid deadlift, okay? So it takes some practice. You might need to film it and take a look at it, but the knees should extend first. Once the bar is at about the level, then I'll start to extend the hips. If someone is doing like a kettlebell deadlift or a dumbbell deadlift to some variation, that's not as important because it doesn't get in the way of the knees. Now, if you're using kettlebells or dumbbells, like one in each hand, you just want to keep those outside of your legs. If you're using like a single kettlebell, or if you're doing like just a single dumbbell, like a sumo thing, you just obviously it's going to be between your feet. So I'll try to demonstrate that with the kettlebell. But if you're using a barbell, one thing I do want to say real quick is there's a lot of different styles. There's a lot of ways to set it up. If you're doing some kind of conventional deadlift, just make sure your hands are a little bit wider than your legs. You don't want them to be on top of your legs, okay? So they should be like just outside of the legs. For some people that'll mean they just need to spread the hands a little bit. For other people that might mean they'll do better to bring the feet in a little. Let me see here. So I think those are the main points I wanted to get across as far as this is like a beginner's introduction to the deadlift. Don't make it too complicated. The deadlift is a fantastic exercise. If you start doing it, it is something that you could literally spend several years mastering, okay? So don't try and set PRs like right off the bat. I think actually on the PR note, something else I'm going to say, some people will teach to look up when you pull because the body follows the head. So if you look up, it makes it easier to keep the back flat. However, if you look up all the time, it puts a shear force on your neck. It's not good for your neck. So I'm okay with someone using looking up as a strategy, as a tactic for setting up personal best to PR. But I don't like it at all for general pulling. Okay, so like day-to-day pulling. And that takes some practice to get used to. So, but you want to make absolutely positive that your back is neutral. When your spine is neutral, you're going to be very safe. You don't want to arch your low back or your upper back. I am aware that some powerlifters will arch their upper back to shorten the line of pull. This video is not about powerlifting. It's about introducing deadlifts for beginners. So I recommend keeping a neutral spine all the way. Which means there'll be some curve to the spine, but it should be like the natural curve, not an exaggerated thing to make the deadlift shorter. Something else I want to point out is shoes. So in the video I'm wearing Chucks, Converse. Those are kind of a classic choice. They're good because they have the shoe is very flat, so from the heel to the toe it's consistent, and it's a solid rubber sole, so the shoes aren't squishy. So the main thing you want is like not a squishy shoe. So like a lot of shoes that are fashionable, they're not good, particularly for deadlifts or any kind of pull or really any kind of lower body work. There's a lot more options now than there once were, but Chucks are a good kind of standard thing. I also wear minimalist shoes a lot, so like Merrell and New Balance, and I'm sure there's others. I haven't like done a product check, but a minimalist shoe is basically going to let your foot do what it's supposed to do. Now, one thing I like to point out, because when you get into that some people will decide to lift barefoot, and that might be okay, but you also want to look at how you're going to be applying the force you're training. So if you're training for anything specific, you need to take that into account. As an example, if you're training for any kind of Olympic lifting, you should be wearing Olympic lifting shoes. And if you are competing in Olympic lifting, you're probably not watching this video because that's not what it's about or what it's geared towards. Lifting shoes, while I'm on that, those would be fine too. You just have to understand that those have a raised heel. That makes the front squat a little easier, makes the catch a little bit easier on the clean. The main thing is don't wear it, so like if you would describe your shoe as bouncy, no, it's not good, okay? If you describe your shoes as cute, also probably not good. You want either like a solid sole and or like a real minimalist sole. So for shoes, that's about it. Now, as far as like kind of wrapping up the teaching points on the deadlift, what you're going to do is approach the weight. It's important you don't have any distractions, okay? So don't be like pulling while you're watching the news or some other nonsense or talking to somebody. When you're pulling, you should be pulling. As kind of a side note, you also want to be very conscious of the people around you. Okay, like your safety is ultimately up to you. Don't leave that in the hands of other people because they'll let you down. Make sure you're in a dedicated space where someone isn't going to just walk into you. That might sound ridiculous, but it happens. I've talked to one of my former athletes recently who literally had someone walk right into his bar while he was attempting a personal best. So just be very conscious of that. Don't just assume people are paying attention. All right. So you approach the weight. You're focused on your deadlift. You're not thinking about other things. If you're thinking about other things, walk away, clear your head, come back to it. Approach the bar, the kettlebell, the dumbbell, whatever it is, approach it. When you're getting set up for it, for some people it helps to think about pushing your hips back like you're trying to find a chair. It'll depend on the style, but that's a good teaching point for what I demonstrated here and whatever. For a lot of pulls, so just if you think about like pretend there's a chair behind you and you're trying to find it with your bottom, just push your hips back. So get set, whatever get your set position, grasp it, take a deep breath, brace, lift, let some air off, take a breath, push your hips back until the bar is on the ground, or whatever you're putting it down on, or until you've reached the end of the rep. And again, like if you're learning how to pull, you might be pulling mid-shin, you might be pulling below the knee, above the knee. There's a lot of different things you can do. But to whatever the end of range of motion is, and then either stop or repeat depending on what strength quality you're trying to improve. So, happy pulling.